Here, in communities like Manenberg, Hanover Park, Mitchell's Plain, and Lavender Hill, life is shadowed by the constant threat of gang violence. This is not just crime. This is war.
A gunfight kicks off in Manenberg, Cape Town. This is not an uncommon occurrence. In fact, in July 2016, 355 rounds were fired in this gang-ridden area. That's an average of 11 shots a day.
In Manenberg, the air is thick with memory. It was here that the Hard Livings gang was born, weaving its roots deep into the townships. Over time, Manenberg grew into a violent epicenter. Poverty, inequality, and limited opportunity became the soil from which gang turf wars sprouted. The Hard Livings stood firm in their territory, but they did not stand alone. Rivals like the Americans emerged, and the rivalry would shape decades of bloodshed. Not far away, in Hanover Park, the violence became part of everyday life. Families wake to the crack of gunfire. Neighborhoods fracture along invisible lines, where different gangs claim different corners. The Americans' gangs split, giving birth to new, more dangerous factions, and the competition for power turned old alliances into sources of betrayal. Mitchell's Plain, one of the largest and most populous townships on the Cape Flats, is equally scarred. In its districts, Tafelsig, Eastridge, and others, the social fabric frays under the weight of unemployment, drug trade, and gunfire. What began in the late 1980s and 1990s as social disintegration morphed into organized crime. Drive-by shootings, turf wars, and assassination-style murders paint a grim picture. Then there is Lavender Hill, a community with a painful history. Created during Apartheid as a dumping ground for people forced from their homes under the Group Areas Act, Lavender Hill has never fully shaken the legacy of marginalization. Today, it carries a new burden: constant territorial battles between gangs like the Fast Guns and the Mongrels, turning its streets into war zones. To understand how this all happened, we must travel back in time. Under Apartheid, large populations were uprooted and relocated to the Cape Flats.
On the 11th of February 1966, District 6 was declared a white-only area. Over the next 2 decades, over 60,000 people were forcibly removed, their homes destroyed. Most were moved to the windswept and barren lands known as the Cape Flats.
These communities were built with little infrastructure, trapped in poverty, lacking in resources, and with few economic opportunities. In that vacuum, gangs found fertile ground. They offered belonging, power, protection, and they fed on desperation. The gang structure on the Cape Flats is not simple. There are the old, well-known names like the Hard Livings, founded in Manenberg in the early 1970s, whose flag once bore the British Union Jack.
The very names suggest the genesis of a gang like the Hard Livings. So if we are struggling together, we find strength, we find resolve, we find organization, and we find profit in joining up our efforts.
It's believed at least 30 gangs operate in the city, including the Americans, the 28s, the Dixie Boys, the Sexy Boys, and the Junkie Funky Kids.
The key issue in South Africa in terms of the murder rate has been the influx of high-powered firearms into Cape Town.
How are gangs getting so many guns? In the Western Cape, community leaders say thousands of firearms flow through Cape Flats via illegal channels, including theft from police and corruption inside the system. One damning figure: illegal firearms on the Cape Flats are linked to over 1,000 murders in 6 years. In one scandal, a senior police officer allegedly sold thousands of guns, intended for destruction, instead to gangs.
Many of these guns aren't coming from criminal networks, but from the police. In 2016, Chris Prinsloo, a former police colonel, pleaded guilty to selling 2,400 guns to an arms dealer who sold them on to gangsters.
We're coming to you from a gangster's paradise, Mitchell's Plain, where criminals are ruling the streets. Residents live in constant fear for their lives. I've borrowed this bulletproof vest from police who are struggling to get a grip on crime here.
The Cape Flats, notorious for gang wars and drugs. it has one of the highest murder rates in the world. In Hanover Park alone, 20 gangs vie for territory, and yet thousands of people call this place home.
Illegal drugs fuel crime in South Africa.
South Africa, one of the most industrialized countries in African continent, is struggling to fight crime. Communities across the country are under siege for violent criminals. Authorities are not in denial and citizens are pleading for tough measures from the government.
Over the past decade, this conflict has been fueled by deadly weapons.
While some shootings are intentional, others are purely victims caught in the crossfire. 8-year-old Ziad George was on his way to the shops on a Sunday morning when a stray bullet ended up in his spine. He will be disabled for life.
Als je gangster is, en één ding weet je, met je mensen op pad afstaan, dan is aan je broers willen, dan is je broers nou gezegd dat je ons lijn alleen ons, je broers nou gezegd dat je ons kap vast ons lijn, ding is maar maak je voor je schiet zomaar die ding, aan het gebeuren jong.
In the early 2000s, the crisis became so acute that the army was deployed to gang hotspots, Manenberg, Mitchell's Plain, Hanover Park, in an attempt to restore order. A single year of gang war on the Cape Flats has taken more than 100 lives. Behind the headlines are deep fractures within the gangs themselves, splintering leadership, broken loyalties, and new, more unpredictable figures rising to power. In recent years, the landscape has only grown more volatile. Major gangs are breaking apart, forming smaller, more aggressive offshoots driven by ideological rifts, turf disputes, or competition for profit. In Hanover Park, for example, internal conflict within the Americans led to the birth of the incredibly gifted Bastards, a symbol of how unstable the old structures have become. Firearms, once controlled by a select few senior gang members, have become alarmingly accessible. Weapons move through both legal and illegal channels. Licensed owners, private security firms, corrupt officials, and underground networks. With more guns on the street, each feud becomes deadlier than the one before. The human cost is devastating. In a single month, September, nearly 500 gang-related shootings were recorded. In Hanover Park, families live under a constant soundtrack of automatic gunfire. Children stay indoors, terrified to play outside. Parents pray their loved ones return home safely. This is daily life. Not an exception, but a routine. What makes the Cape Flats so feared goes far beyond crime statistics. Gang culture has become woven into the social fabric, generational and cyclical. Young people are often absorbed into the same structures that shaped their parents, not out of choice, but because alternatives simply do not exist. Opportunity is scarce. Hope is fragile. The streets become the only path many see.